Right now, three American aircraft carriers, representing over $30 billion in assets and 15,000 personnel, are floating in a body of water you could drive across in 90 minutes. The USS Gerald R. Ford cost $13 billion to build, making it the most expensive warship ever constructed, according to the U.S. Naval Institute. The USS Abraham Lincoln and the Ford Carrier Strike Groups are now operating in the Persian Gulf as of March 2026. Each carrier displaces 100,000 tons, stands 250 feet tall, carries 60 to 75 aircraft, and houses 5,000 sailors. You're being told this is a show of overwhelming force, maximum pressure, deterrence. Here's what you're not being told. Iran's military leadership called this deployment the opportunity of a century. Because the Persian Gulf isn't an ocean, it's 600 miles wide at its broadest point. The Strait of Hormuz, the only exit, is 21 nautical miles across at its narrowest navigable point, according to industry reports. That's narrower than the distance between Manhattan and JFK Airport. In open ocean, a carrier traveling at 35 miles per hour expands its potential location to 6,000 square miles within 90 minutes, nearly impossible to target. In the Persian Gulf, there's nowhere to hide. Iran's College Fars missiles travel at Mach 3 to Mach 4 with a 300-kilometer range. Their Abu Mahdi cruise missiles reach over 1,000 kilometers with AI-assisted guidance, according to Defense Security Asia. When you follow the strategic mathematics, you find something the Pentagon doesn't want you to see. The most powerful weapons in the American arsenal just sailed into a kill zone designed specifically to destroy them. And what you'll see by the end is that your gas prices, your retirement account, and potentially American sons and daughters in uniform all depend on whether U.S. planners learn this lesson before Iran teaches it the hard way. This story doesn't start in February 2026. It starts April 18, 1988. Operation Praying Mantis. The U.S. Navy's last major engagement with Iran resulted in the sinking of 2 Iranian frigates, 1 gunboat, and 3 speedboats. 56 Iranian personnel killed versus 2 U.S. casualties. A complete, humiliating defeat for Iran's conventional navy. That loss forced Iran's strategic pivot. If they couldn't match U.S. naval power ship for ship, they would make the battlefield itself their weapon. Over 38 years, Iran built what Rear Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, commander of the IRGC Navy, now calls their layered defense. The IRGC Navy operates over 2,500 fast attack boats designed for swarm tactics, according to the national interest. Iran unveiled 112 new offensive speedboats in a single ceremony on May 28, 2020, reported globalsecurity.org. They possess an estimated 2,500 to 3,000 ballistic missiles and over 3,000 naval mines. Iran's Ghadr 380 anti-ship cruise missile has a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers and uses sea-skimming flight profiles, according to the national interest. Their Noor missile reaches 120 kilometers, while the Qatar extends to 300 kilometers, reported Wyon. The trap was set. They just needed America to sail into it. In January 2026, protests erupted across Iran. The Trump administration saw opportunity, regime change through maximum pressure. The military buildup that followed was the largest since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, according to Wikipedia's documentation of the 2026 military buildup. At least 200 heavy transport flights of C-17 and C-5 Galaxy aircraft arrived in the Middle East since mid-January. Approximately 35 F-15E Strike Eagles deployed to Jordan. 12 F-22 fighter jets reached Avda Air Base in southern Israel on February 24th. Then the carriers arrived. First the Abraham Lincoln, redirected from the South China Sea. Then the Gerald R. Ford, ordered east from Caribbean operations. But here's what none of this explains. Why would the U.S. concentrate its most valuable assets in the most dangerous waters on Earth? And that missing piece is exactly what the next part reveals. In a warehouse outside Isfahan, Iranian engineers loaded the first batch of missiles onto transport trucks. Mobile launchers, the kind that can fire, relocate, and disappear within minutes. Here's the incentive chain nobody's connecting. Iran's regime survival depends on one thing: making the cost of American military action unbearable. Not winning a war, making the price too high. Each U.S. destroyer in a carrier strike group carries approximately 90 defensive missiles. Iran can launch 500 simultaneous threats, swarm boats from islands, cruise missiles from mobile coastal launchers, ballistic missiles from inland sites, drones from concealed positions, and naval mines and choke points. The mathematics don't work. If even 30% of Iranian weapons function as advertised, that's 450 credible threats against defensive systems designed for sequential engagements, not saturation. The cost-exchange ratio is devastating. Iran's 1,500 swarm boats cost perhaps $500,000 each. Total investment of $750 million. One Ford-class carrier costs $13 billion. Iran could lose every boat and still come out ahead if they sink one carrier. This is what retired Marine General Paul Van Riper proved in 2002. In the U.S. military's largest war game, Millennium Challenge, Van Riper commanded Red Team, playing Iran, against Blue Team's carrier strike group. He used swarm tactics with small boats, motorcycle messengers to avoid electronic surveillance, and cruise missiles disguised as civilian aircraft. In the opening hours, he sank 16 Blue Team ships, including a carrier, killing 20,000 simulated U.S. personnel, the worst U.S. naval loss since Pearl Harbor. Exercise officials halted the game, reset the rules, and forced Van Riper's tactics to fail. He resigned in protest, warning the military was script-writing victories rather than learning. That was 24 years ago. His tactics are now Iran's official doctrine. The IRGC Navy has 55,000 sailors and 33,000 boats covering areas from the Persian Gulf to Tanzania, according to Wikipedia. And there's one more layer that changes everything. It happened on February 28, 2026, and it removed every restraint Iran had left. 600 miles south, at a military compound in Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed on February 28, 2026, when U.S. and Israeli forces struck Iran. Iran immediately activated something called decentralized mosaic defense, pre-positioned commanders with authority to act independently if central command is destroyed. This is the nightmare scenario, a military designed to keep fighting even after leadership decapitation. Within 72 hours, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped by approximately 70%, then to near zero, according to Wikipedia's documentation of the 2026 Strait crisis. 20 million barrels of oil per day, 20% of global petroleum consumption, stopped flowing, reported the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That represents 27% of global maritime oil trade, according to the Congressional Research Service. Iran announced only Chinese vessels could pass. Roughly 100 cargo vessels normally transit the strait daily, with 60–70% being oil tankers and gas carriers, according to Visual Capitalist. The sea went silent. What you're watching is what Sun Tzu identified 2,500 years ago as the supreme art of war. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Iran doesn't need to sink carriers to win. They just need to make the risk unbearable. The historical parallel is precise. December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, destroying or damaging 18 U.S. warships, including 8 battleships, killing 2,103 Americans in a single morning. The attack succeeded because the U.S. concentrated its most valuable naval assets in a confined harbor, believing the shallow 40-foot depth made torpedo attacks impossible. Japanese engineers modified torpedoes with wooden fins to run in shallow water, asymmetric innovation that neutralized America's technological superiority. Today's parallel is exact. 3 carriers worth over $30 billion concentrated in the Persian Gulf. Average depth 160 feet, with Iran having spent 38 years perfecting shallow water tactics specifically designed to exploit this vulnerability. The difference, like Pearl Harbor's battleships, were already becoming obsolete. Today's carriers are the centerpiece of U.S. power projection. After the Russian cruiser Moskva was sunk by Ukrainian Neptune missiles in 2022, retired Admiral James Stavridis wrote that the sinking is a stark reminder of the vulnerability of surface ships, including aircraft carriers, to relatively low-cost, numerous, and technologically advanced cruise missiles. A 4-star admiral publicly acknowledging carrier vulnerability. The cost-exchange ratio is catastrophic. Iran could fire 100 missiles for the cost of 0.015% of a Ford-class carrier. And here's the part that every person with savings, every parent, every American with a 401k needs to hear. Here's what this means for your life, in dollars and days. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of global oil supply. Historically, a 10% supply disruption causes 50% or more price increases. When Iran closed the strait in March 2026, oil prices spiked. Gasoline jumps $2 to $3 per gallon within weeks. Everything ships by truck, food, consumer goods, manufacturing inputs, so inflation accelerates across the entire economy. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice: raise rates to fight inflation and trigger recession, or keep rates low and accept runaway prices. Your 401k craters as markets panic. Recession risk jumps above 60%. Unemployment rises. China receives 33% of its oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz, according to Visual Capitalist. Beijing faces energy crisis. Saudi Arabia accounts for 37.2% of crude exports through the strait. Iraq contributes 22.8%, and UAE adds 12.9%. Combined bypass capacity through pipelines covers roughly 33% of aggregate Gulf export flows, according to the Energy Information Administration, meaning two-thirds of the oil has no alternative route. A very large crude carrier costs over $200,000 per day to charter from Middle East to China as of February 27, 2026, reported Logistics Middle East. Insurance premiums skyrocket. Lloyd's of London starts refusing coverage. The loss of even one carrier, 5,000 Americans dead in an afternoon, would exceed casualties from the September 11th attacks or Operation Iraqi Freedom. Political consequences. Immediate crisis of confidence in U.S. military capability. If America can't protect its own carriers, how can it protect allies? Adversaries globally are emboldened. Now here's the counter-argument. Carriers have layered defenses: Aegis destroyers, submarines, F-35s, electronic warfare. No carrier has been sunk since World War II. All true. And irrelevant. Because Aegis is designed for sequential threats, not saturation. The 2002 Millennium Challenge proved that swarm tactics can overwhelm layered defenses. Modern Iranian missiles use AI-assisted guidance, dual-mode seekers, and sea-skimming flight profiles specifically designed to evade Aegis. Even if only 30% of Iranian weapons work, that's 150 credible threats against systems carrying 90 defensive missiles per destroyer. The quality doesn't need to be perfect when quantity is overwhelming. So what do you actually do with this information? That's exactly what the final part reveals. So what do you actually do with this? First, understand the pattern you just learned. Sun Tzu's principle of attacking where unprepared, appearing where unexpected. Iran spent 38 years transforming confined waters into a weapon that inverts material superiority into catastrophic vulnerability. This is asymmetric warfare, the weak defeating the strong by changing the battlefield geometry. Second, watch these specific signals. If additional carriers are ordered to the Gulf despite current concentration, that's strategic overcommitment, the moment before historical disasters. If tanker insurance premiums through Hormuz exceed 5% of cargo value, that's the threshold where commercial shipping becomes economically impossible. If Saudi Arabia activates its east-west pipeline to maximum 5 million barrels per day capacity, that's confirmation. Gulf states expect sustained closure. Third, your financial positioning. Energy sector exposure increases dramatically in Hormuz closure scenarios. Defense stocks initially spike on conflict news, then crater when carrier vulnerability becomes consensus. $13 billion ships suddenly worth scrap value if they can't operate safely. Timing matters. Smart money has historically moved 11 to 14 days after major geopolitical shocks, not during the initial panic. Fourth, the detection pattern. When you see military assets concentrating in confined waters, ask what asymmetric weapons the adversary has spent decades perfecting for exactly that geometry. When you see official statements about invulnerability, look for suppressed wargame results like Millennium Challenge. The official story was overwhelming force and deterrence. When you followed the strategic mathematics, you found a $30 billion trap designed over 38 years. The aircraft carrier dominated naval warfare for 80 years. Not because the technology failed, but because adversaries found the geometry where expensive platforms become expensive targets. The question isn't whether this pattern is real. You just watched it unfold. The question is whether you position yourself before or after everyone else figures out what concentrated vulnerability looks like when the trap finally closes.